Section number 1 of Chapter 19 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill McGovern. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 19, Section 1. While England was agitated, first by the dread of an invasion, and then by joy at the deliverance wrought for her by the valour of her seamen, important events were taking place on the continent. On the 6th of March the King had arrived at the Hague, and had proceeded to make his arrangements for the approaching campaign. The prospect which lay before him was gloomy. The coalition of which he was the author and the chief had, during some months, been in constant danger of dissolution. By what strenuous exertions, by what ingenious expedients, by what blandishments, by what bribes, he succeeded in preventing his allies from throwing themselves one by one at the feet of France, can be but imperfectly known. The fullest and most authentic record of the labours and sacrifices by which he kept together during 8 years a crowd of faint-hearted and treacherous potentates, negligent of the common interest and jealous of each other, is to be found in his correspondence with Heinsius. In that correspondence William is all himself. He had, in the course of his eventful life, to sustain some high parts for which he was not eminently qualified, and in those parts his success was imperfect. As sovereign of England he showed abilities and virtues which entitle him to honourable mention in history. But his deficiencies were great. He was to the last a stranger amongst us, cold, reserved, never in good spirits, never at his ease. His kingdom was a place of exile. His finest palaces were prisons. He was always counting the days which must elapse before he should again see the land of his birth, the clipped trees, the wings of the innumerable windmills, the nests of the storks on the tall gables, and the long lines of painted villas reflected in the sleeping canals. He took no pains to hide the preference which he felt for his native soil and for his early friends, and therefore, though he rendered great services to our country, he did not reign in our hearts. As a general in the field, again, he showed rare courage and capacity, but, from whatever cause, he was, as a tactician, inferior to some of his contemporaries, who, in general powers of mind, were far inferior to him. The business for which he was preeminently fitted was diplomacy, in the highest sense of the word. It may be doubted whether he has ever had a superior in the art of conducting those great negotiations on which the welfare of the commonwealth of nations depends. His skill in this department of politics was never more severely tasked or more signally proved than during the latter part of 1691 and the earlier part of 1692. One of his chief difficulties was caused by the sullen and menacing demeanour of the northern powers. Denmark and Sweden had at one time seemed disposed to join the coalition, but they had early become cold and were fast becoming hostile. From France they flattered themselves that they had little to fear. It was not very probable that her armies would cross the Elbe, or that her fleets would force a passage through the Sound. But the naval strength of England and Holland united might well excite apprehension at Stockholm and Copenhagen. Soon arose vexatious questions of maritime right, questions such as, in almost every extensive war of modern times, have arisen between belligerents and neutrals. The Scandinavian princes complained that the legitimate trade between the Baltic and France was tyrannically interrupted. Though they had not in general been on very friendly terms with each other, they began to draw close together, intrigued at every petty court, and tried to form what William called a third party in Europe. The King of Sweden, who, as Duke of Pomerania, was bound to send 3,000 men for the defence of the empire, sent, instead of them, his advice that the allies would make peace on the best terms which they could get. The King of Denmark seized a great number of Dutch merchant ships, and collected in Holstein an army which caused no small uneasiness to his neighbours. "I fear," William wrote in an hour of deep dejection to Heinsius, "I fear that the object of this third party is a peace which will bring in its train the slavery of Europe. The day will come when Sweden and her confederates will know too late how great an error they have committed. They are farther, no doubt, than we from the danger, and therefore it is that they are thus bent on working our ruin and their own. That France will now consent to reasonable terms is not to be expected, and it were better to fall sword in hand than to submit to whatever she may dictate." While the King was thus disquieted by the conduct of the northern powers, ominous signs began to appear in a very different quarter. It had from the first been no easy matter to induce sovereigns who hated and who in their own dominions persecuted the Protestant religion to countenance the revolution which had saved that religion from a great peril. But happily the example and the authority of the Vatican had overcome their scruples. Innocent XI and Alexander VIII had regarded William with ill-concealed partiality. He was not indeed their friend, but he was their enemy's enemy, and James had been, and if restored must again be, their enemy's vassal. To the heretic nephew, therefore, they gave their effective support; to the orthodox uncle only compliments and benedictions. But Alexander VIII had occupied the papal throne little more than 15 months. His successor, Antonio Pignatelli, who took the name of Innocent XII, was impatient to be reconciled to Louis. Louis was now sensible that he had committed a great error when he had roused against himself at once the spirit of Protestantism and the spirit of Popery. He permitted the French bishops to submit themselves to the Holy See. The dispute, which had at one time seemed likely to end in a great Gallican schism, was accommodated, and there was reason to believe that the influence of the head of the Church would be exerted for the purpose of severing the ties which bound so many Catholic princes to the Calvinist who had usurped the British throne. Meanwhile, the coalition which the third party on one side and the Pope on the other were trying to dissolve was in no small danger of falling to pieces from mere rottenness. Two of the allied powers, and two only, were hearty in the common cause: England, drawing after her the other British kingdoms, and Holland, drawing after her the other Batavian commonwealths. England and Holland were indeed torn by internal factions, and were separated from each other by mutual jealousies and antipathies. But both were fully resolved not to submit to French domination, and both were ready to bear their share, and more than their share, of the charges of the contest. Most of the members of the confederacy were not nations, but men, an emperor, a king, electors, dukes. And of these men there was scarcely one whose whole soul was in the struggle, scarcely one who did not hang back, who did not find some excuse for omitting to fulfil his engagements, who did not expect to be hired to defend his own rights and interests against the common enemy. But the war was the war of the people of England and of the people of Holland. Had it not been so, the burdens which it made necessary would not have been borne by either England or Holland during a single year. When William said that he would rather die sword in hand than humble himself before France, he expressed what was felt, not by himself alone, but by two great communities of which he was the first magistrate. With those two communities, unhappily, other states had little sympathy. Indeed, those two communities were regarded by other states as rich, plain-dealing, generous dupes are regarded by needy sharpers. England and Holland were wealthy, and they were zealous. Their wealth excited the cupidity of the whole alliance, and to that wealth their zeal was the key. They were persecuted with sordid importunity by all their confederates, from Caesar, who, in the pride of his solitary dignity, would not honour King William with the title of Majesty, down to the smallest Margrave, who could see his whole principality from the cracked windows of the mean and ruinous old house which he called his palace. It was not enough that England and Holland furnished much more than their contingents to the war by land, and bore unassisted the whole charge of the war by sea. They were beset by a crowd of illustrious mendicants, some rude, some obsequious, but all indefatigable and insatiable. One prince came mumping to them annually with a lamentable story about his distresses. A more sturdy beggar threatened to join the third party and to make a separate peace with France, if his demands were not granted. Every sovereign, too, had his ministers and favourites, and these ministers and favourites were perpetually hinting that France was willing to pay them for detaching their masters from the coalition, and that it would be prudent in England and Holland to outbid France. Yet the embarrassment caused by the rapacity of the allied courts was scarcely greater than the embarrassment caused by their ambition and their pride. This prince had set his heart on some childish distinction, a title or a cross, and would do nothing for the common cause till his wishes were accomplished. That prince chose to fancy that he had been slighted, and would not stir till reparation had been made to him. The Duke of Brunswick-Lunenburg would not furnish a battalion for the defence of Germany unless he was made an elector. The Elector of Brandenburg declared that he was as hostile as he had ever been to France, but he had been ill-used by the Spanish government, and he therefore would not suffer his soldiers to be employed in the defence of the Spanish Netherlands. He was willing to bear his share of the war, but it must be in his own way. He must have the command of a distinct army, and he must be stationed between the Rhine and the Meuse. The Elector of Saxony complained that bad winter quarters had been assigned to his troops. He therefore recalled them just when they should have been preparing to take the field, but very coolly offered to send them back if England and Holland would give him 400,000 rix-dollars. It might have been expected that at least the two chiefs of the House of Austria would have put forth at this conjuncture all their strength against the rival House of Bourbon. Unfortunately, they could not be induced to exert themselves vigorously, even for their own preservation. They were deeply interested in keeping the French out of Italy, yet they could with difficulty be prevailed upon to lend the smallest assistance to the Duke of Savoy. They seemed to think it the business of England and Holland to defend the passes of the Alps, and to prevent the armies of Louis from overflowing Lombardy. To the Emperor, indeed, the war against France was a secondary object. His first object was the war against Turkey. He was dull and bigoted. His mind misgave him that war against France was, in some sense, a war against the Catholic religion, and the war against Turkey was a crusade. His recent campaign on the Danube had been successful. He might easily have concluded an honourable peace with the Porte, and have turned his arms westward, but he had conceived the hope that he might extend his hereditary dominions at the expense of the infidels. Visions of a triumphant entry into Constantinople and of a Te Deum in St. Sophia's had risen in his brain. He not only employed in the east a force more than sufficient to have defended Piedmont and reconquered Lorraine, but he seemed to think that England and Holland were bound to reward him largely for neglecting their interests and pursuing his own. Spain already was what she continued to be down to our own time. Of the Spain which had domineered over the land and the ocean, over the old and the new world, of the Spain which had, in the short space of 12 years, led captive a Pope and a King of France, a sovereign of Mexico and a sovereign of Peru, of the Spain which had sent an army to the walls of Paris and had equipped a mighty fleet to invade England, nothing remained but an arrogance which had once excited terror and hatred, but which now could excite only derision. In extent, indeed, the dominions of the Catholic king exceeded those of Rome when Rome was at the zenith of power. But the huge mass lay torpid and helpless, and could be insulted or despoiled with impunity. The whole administration, military and naval, financial and colonial, was utterly disorganized. Charles was a fit representative of his kingdom, impotent physically, intellectually, and morally, sunk in ignorance, listlessness, and superstition, yet swollen with the notion of his own dignity, and quick to imagine and resent affronts. So wretched has his education been that when he was told of the fall of Mons, the most important fortress in his vast empire, he asked whether Mons was in England. Among the ministers who were raised up and pulled down by his sickly caprice was none capable of applying a remedy to the distempers of the state. In truth, to brace anew the nerves of that paralyzed body would have occupied a hard task even for Ximenes. No servant of the Spanish crown occupied a more important post, and none was more unfit for an important post than the Marquis of Castanaga. He was governor of the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands it seemed probable that the fate of Christendom would be decided. He had discharged his trust, as every public trust was then discharged, in every part of that vast monarchy on which it was boastfully said the sun never set. Fertile and rich as was the country which he ruled, he threw on England and Holland the whole charge of defending it. He expected that arms, ammunition, wagons, provisions, everything would be furnished by the heretics. It had never occurred to him that it was his business and not theirs to put Mons in a condition to stand a siege. The public voice loudly accused him of having sold that celebrated stronghold to France, but it is probable that he was guilty of nothing worse than the haughty apathy and sluggishness characteristic of his nation. Such was the state of the coalition of which William was the head. There were moments when he felt himself overwhelmed, when his spirits sank, when his patience was wearied out, and when his constitutional irritability broke forth. "I cannot," he wrote, "offer a suggestion without being met by a demand for a subsidy." "I have refused point blank," he wrote on another occasion, when he had been importuned for money. "It is impossible that the States General and England can bear the charge of the army on the Rhine, of the army in Piedmont, and of the whole defence of Flanders, to say nothing of the immense cost of the naval war. If our allies can do nothing for themselves, the sooner the alliance goes to pieces the better." But, after every short fit of despondency and ill humour, he called up all the forces of his mind and put a strong curb on his temper. Weak, mean, false, selfish, as too many of the confederates were, it was only by their help that he could accomplish what he had from his youth up considered as his mission. If they abandoned him, France would be dominant, without a rival in Europe. Well as they deserved to be punished, he would not, to punish them, acquiesce in the subjugation of the whole civilized world. He set himself, therefore, to surmount some difficulties and to evade others. The Scandinavian powers he conciliated by waiving, reluctantly indeed, and not without a hard internal struggle, some of his maritime rights. At Rome, his influence, though indirectly exercised, balanced that of the Pope himself. Louis and James found that they had not a friend at the Vatican except Innocent, and Innocent, whose nature was gentle and irresolute, shrank from taking a course directly opposed to the sentiments of all who surrounded him. In private conversations with Jacobite agents he declared himself devoted to the interests of the House of Stuart, but in his public acts he observed a strict neutrality. He sent 20,000 crowns to Saint-Germain, but he excused himself to the enemies of France by protesting this was not a subsidy for any political purpose, but merely an alms to be distributed among poor British Catholics. He permitted prayers for the good cause to be read in the English College at Rome, but he insisted that those prayers should be drawn up in general terms, and that no name should be mentioned. It was in vain that the ministers of the House of Stuart and Bourbon adjured him to take a more decided course. "God knows," he exclaimed on one occasion, "that I would gladly shed my blood to restore the King of England. But what can I do? If I stir, I am told that I am favouring the French, and helping them set up a universal monarchy. I am not like the old popes. Kings will not listen to me as they listened to my predecessors. There is no religion now, nothing but wicked, worldly policy. The Prince of Orange is master. He governs us all. He has got such a hold on the Emperor and on the King of Spain that neither of them dares to displease him. God help us. He alone can help us." And as the old man spoke, he beat the table with his hand in an agony of impotent grief and indignation. End of section 1. Recording by Bill McGovern.
Section 2 of Chapter 19 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 19, Section 2. To keep the German princes steady was no easy task, but it was accomplished. Money was distributed among them, much less indeed than they asked, but much more than they had any decent pretence for asking. With the Elector of Saxony a composition was made. He had, together with a strong appetite for subsidies, a great desire to be a member of the most select and illustrious orders of knighthood. It seems that, instead of the 400,000 rixdollars which he had demanded, he consented to accept 100,000 and the garter. His Prime Minister Schöning, the most covetous and perfidious of mankind, was secured by a pension. For the Duke of Brunswick-Lunenburg, William, not without difficulty, procured the long-desired title of Elector of Hanover. By such means as these, the breaches which had divided the coalition were so skilfully repaired that it appeared still to present a firm front to the enemy. William had complained bitterly to the Spanish government of the incapacity and inertness of Gastanaga. The Spanish government, helpless and drowsy as it was, could not be altogether insensible to the dangers which threatened Flanders and Brabant. Gastanaga was recalled, and William was invited to take upon himself the government of the Low Countries, with powers not less than regal. Philip II would not easily have believed that, within a century after his death, his great-grandson would implore the great-grandson of William the Silent to exercise the authority of a sovereign at Brussels. The offer was in one sense tempting, but William was too wise to accept it. He knew that the population of the Spanish Netherlands was firmly attached to the Church of Rome. Every act of a Protestant ruler was certain to be regarded with suspicion by the clergy and people of those countries. Already Gastanaga, mortified by his disgrace, had written to inform the court of Rome that changes were in contemplation which would make Ghent and Antwerp as heretical as Amsterdam and London. It had doubtless also occurred to William that if, by governing mildly and justly, and by showing a decent respect for the ceremonies and the ministers of the Roman Catholic religion, he should succeed in obtaining the confidence of the Belgians, he would inevitably raise against himself a storm of obloquy in our island. He knew by experience what it was to govern two nations strongly attached to two different churches. A large party among the Episcopalians of England could not forgive him for having consented to the establishment of the Presbyterian polity in Scotland. A large party among the Presbyterians of Scotland blamed him for maintaining the episcopal polity in England. If he now took under his protection masses, processions, graven images, friaries, nunneries, and, worst of all, Jesuit pulpits, Jesuit confessionals, and Jesuit colleges, what could he expect but that England and Scotland would join in one cry of reprobation? He therefore refused to accept the government of the Low Countries, and proposed that it should be entrusted to the Elector of Bavaria. The Elector of Bavaria was, after the Emperor, the most powerful of the Roman Catholic potentates of Germany. He was young, brave, and ambitious of military distinction. The Spanish court was willing to appoint him, and he was desirous to be appointed. But much delay was caused by an absurd difficulty. The Elector thought it beneath him to ask for what he wished to have. The formalists of the cabinet of Madrid thought it beneath the dignity of the Catholic king to give what had not been asked. Mediation was necessary, and was at last successful. But much time was lost, and the spring was far advanced before the new governor of the Netherlands entered on his functions. William had saved the coalition from the danger of perishing by disunion. But by no remonstrance, by no entreaty, by no bribe, could he prevail on his allies to be early in the field. They ought to have profited by the severe lesson which had been given them in the preceding year. But again every one of them lingered, and wondered why the rest were lingering. And again he who singly wielded the whole power of France was found, as his haughty motto had long boasted, a match for a multitude of adversaries. His enemies, while still unready, learned with dismay that he had taken the field in person at the head of his nobility. On no occasion had that gallant aristocracy appeared with more splendour in his train. A single circumstance may suffice to give a notion of the pomp and luxury of his camp. Among the musketeers of his household rode, for the first time, a stripling of 17, who soon afterwards succeeded to the title of Duke of Saint Simon, and to whom we owe those inestimable memoirs which have preserved, for the delight and instruction of many lands and of many generations, the vivid picture of a France which has long passed away. Though the boy's family was at that time very hard pressed for money, he travelled with 35 horses and sumpter mules. The princesses of the blood, each surrounded by a group of high-born and graceful ladies, accompanied the king, and the smiles of so many charming women inspired the throng of vain and voluptuous but high-spirited gentlemen with more than common courage. In the brilliant crowd which surrounded the French Augustus appeared the French Virgil, the graceful, the tender, the melodious Racine. He had, in conformity with the prevailing fashion, become devout, had given up writing for the theatre, and, having determined to apply himself vigorously to the discharge of the duties which belonged to him as historiographer of France, he now came to see the great events which it was his office to record. In the neighbourhood of Mons, Lewis entertained the ladies with the most magnificent review that had ever been seen in modern Europe. 120,000 of the finest troops in the world were drawn up in a line 8 miles long. It may be doubted whether such an army had ever been brought together under the Roman eagles. The show began early in the morning, and was not over when the long summer day closed. Racine left the ground astonished, deafened, dazzled, and tired to death. In a private letter he ventured to give utterance to an amiable wish, which he probably took good care not to whisper in the courtly circle. Would to heaven that all these poor fellows were in their cottages again with their wives and their little ones. After this superb pageant, Lewis announced his intention of attacking Namur. In 5 days he was under the walls of that city, at the head of more than 30,000 men. 20,000 peasants, pressed in those parts of the Netherlands which the French occupied, were compelled to act as pioneers. Luxemburg, with 80,000 men, occupied a strong position on the road between Namur and Brussels, and was prepared to give battle to any force which might attempt to raise the siege. This partition of duties excited no surprise. It had long been known that the great monarch loved sieges, and that he did not love battles. He professed to think that the real test of military skill was a siege. The event of an encounter between two armies on an open plain was, in his opinion, often determined by chance, but only science could prevail against ravelins and bastions which science had constructed. His detractors sneeringly pronounced it fortunate that the department of the military art, which His Majesty considered as the noblest, was one in which it was seldom necessary for him to expose to serious risk a life invaluable to his people. Namur, situated at the confluence of the Sambre and the Meuse, was one of the great fortresses of Europe. The town lay in the plain, and had no strength except what was derived from art. But art and nature had combined to fortify that renowned citadel which, from the summit of a lofty rock, looks down on a boundless expanse of cornfields, woods, and meadows, watered by 2 fine rivers. The people of the city and of the surrounding region were proud of their impregnable castle. Their boast was that never, in all the wars which had devastated the Netherlands, had skill or valour been able to penetrate those walls. The neighbouring fastnesses, famed throughout the world for their strength, Antwerp and Ostend, Ypres, Lille and Tournay, Mons and Valenciennes, Cambrai and Charleroi, Limburg and Luxemburg, had opened their gates to conquerors, but never once had the flag been pulled down from the battlements of Namur. That nothing might be wanting to the interest of the siege, the 2 great masters of the art of fortification were opposed to each other. Vauban had during many years been regarded as the first of engineers. But a formidable rival had lately arisen, Menno, Baron of Cohorn, the ablest officer in the service of the States General. The defences of Namur had been recently strengthened and repaired under Cohorn's superintendence, and he was now within the walls. Vauban was in the camp of Lewis. It might therefore be expected that both the attack and the defence would be conducted with consummate ability. By this time the allied armies had assembled, but it was too late. William hastened towards Namur. He menaced the French works, first from the west, then from the north, then from the east. But between him and the lines of circumvallation lay the army of Luxemburg, turning as he turned, and always so strongly posted that to attack it would have been the height of imprudence. Meanwhile the besiegers, directed by the skill of Vauban and animated by the presence of Lewis, made rapid progress. There were indeed many difficulties to be surmounted and many hardships to be endured. The weather was stormy, and on the 8th of June, the feast of Saint Medard, who holds in the French calendar the same inauspicious place which in our calendar belongs to Saint Swithin, the rain fell in torrents. The Sambre rose and covered many square miles on which the harvest was green. The Méchaine rolled down its bridges to the Meuse. All the roads became swamps. The trenches were so deep in water and mire that it was the business of 3 days to move a gun from one battery to another. The 6,000 wagons which had accompanied the French army were useless. It was necessary that gunpowder, bullets, corn, hay should be carried from place to place on the backs of the war horses. Nothing but the authority of Lewis could, in such circumstances, have maintained order and inspired cheerfulness. His soldiers, in truth, showed much more reverence for him than for what their religion had made sacred. They cursed Saint Medard heartily, and broke or burned every image of him that could be found. But for their king there was nothing that they were not ready to do and to bear. In spite of every obstacle they constantly gained ground. Cohorn was severely wounded while defending with desperate resolution a fort which he had himself constructed, and of which he was proud. His place could not be supplied. The governor was a feeble man whom Gastanaga had appointed, and whom William had recently advised the Elector of Bavaria to remove. The spirit of the garrison gave way. The town surrendered on the 8th day of the siege, the citadel about 3 weeks later. The history of the fall of Namur in 1692 bears a close resemblance to the history of the fall of Mons in 1691. Both in 1691 and in 1692, Lewis, the sole and absolute master of the resources of his kingdom, was able to open the campaign before William, the captain of a coalition, had brought together his dispersed forces. In both years the advantage of having the first move decided the event of the game. At Namur, as at Mons, Lewis, assisted by Vauban, conducted the siege. Luxembourg covered it. William vainly tried to raise it, and, with deep mortification, assisted as a spectator at the victory of his enemy. In one respect, however, the fate of the two fortresses were very different. Mons was delivered up by its own inhabitants. Namur might perhaps have been saved if the garrison had been as zealous and determined as the population. Strange to say, in this place, so long subject to a foreign rule, there was found a patriotism resembling that of the little Greek commonwealths. There is no reason to believe that the burghers cared about the balance of power, or had any preference for James or for William, for the most Christian king or for the most Catholic king. But every citizen considered his own honour as bound up with the honour of the maiden fortress. It is true that the French did not abuse their victory. No outrage was committed. The privileges of the municipality were respected. The magistrates were not changed. Yet the people could not see a conqueror enter their hitherto unconquered castle without tears of rage and shame. Even the barefooted Carmelites, who had renounced all pleasures, all property, all society, all domestic affection, whose days were all fast days, who passed month after month without uttering a word, were strangely moved. It was in vain that Lewis attempted to soothe them by marks of respect and by munificent bounty. Whenever they met a French uniform, they turned their heads away with a look which showed that a life of prayer, of abstinence, and of silence had left one earthly feeling still unsubdued. This was perhaps the moment at which the arrogance of Lewis reached the highest point. He had achieved the last and the most splendid military exploit of his life. His confederated foes, English, Dutch, and German, had, in their own despite, swelled his triumph, and had been witnesses of the glory which made their hearts sick. His exultation was boundless. The inscriptions on the medals which he struck to commemorate his success, the letters by which he enjoined the prelates of his kingdom to sing the Te Deum, were boastful and sarcastic. His people, a people among whose many fine qualities moderation and prosperity cannot be reckoned, seemed for a time to be drunk with pride. Even Boileau, hurried along by the prevailing enthusiasm, forgot the good sense and good taste to which he owed his reputation. He fancied himself a lyric poet, and gave vent to his feelings in 160 lines of frigid bombast about Alcides, Mars, Bacchus, Ceres, the lyre of Orpheus, the Thracian oaks, and the Promethean nymphs. He wondered whether Namur had, like Troy, been built by Apollo and Neptune. He asked what power could subdue a city stronger than that before which the Greeks lay 10 years, and he returned answer to himself that such a miracle could be wrought only by Jupiter or by Lewis. The feather in the hat of Lewis was the lodestar of victory. To Lewis all things must yield, princes, nations, winds, waters. In conclusion, the poet addressed himself to the banded enemies of France, and tauntingly bade them carry back to their homes the tidings that Namur had been taken in their sight. Before many months had elapsed, both the boastful king and the boastful poet were taught that it is prudent as well as graceful to be modest in the hour of victory. One mortification Lewis had suffered even in the midst of his prosperity. While he lay before Namur, he heard the sounds of rejoicing from the distant camp of the allies. 3 peals of thunder from 140 pieces of cannon were answered by 3 volleys from 60,000 muskets. It was soon known that these salutes were fired on account of the battle of La Hogue. The French king exerted himself to appear serene. "They make a strange noise," he said, "about the burning of a few ships." In truth, he was much disturbed, and the more so because a report had reached the Low Countries that there had been a sea fight, and that his fleet had been victorious. His good humour, however, was soon restored by the brilliant success of those operations which were under his own immediate direction. When the siege was over, he left Luxemburg in command of the army, and returned to Versailles. At Versailles the unfortunate Tourville soon presented himself, and was graciously received. As soon as he appeared in the circle, the king welcomed him in a loud voice. "I am perfectly satisfied with you and with my sailors. We have been beaten, it is true, but your honour and that of the nation are unsullied." Though Lewis had quitted the Netherlands, the eyes of all Europe were still fixed on that region. The armies there had been strengthened by reinforcements drawn from many quarters. Everywhere else the military operations of the year were languid and without interest. The Grand Vizier and Louis of Baden did little more than watch each other on the Danube. Marshal Noailles and the Duke of Medina Sidonia did little more than watch each other under the Pyrenees. On the upper Rhine, and along the frontier which separates France from Piedmont, an indecisive predatory war was carried on, by which the soldiers suffered little and the cultivators of the soil much. But all men looked, with anxious expectation of some great event, to the frontier of Brabant, where William was opposed to Luxemburg. Luxemburg, now in his 66th year, had risen, by slow degrees and by the deaths of several great men, to the first place among the generals of his time. He was of that noble house of Montmorency which united many mythical and many historical titles to glory, which boasted that it sprang from the first Frank who was baptized in the name of Christ in the 5th century, and which had, since the 11th century, given to France a long and splendid succession of constables and marshals. In valour and abilities Luxemburg was not inferior to any of his illustrious race. But, highly descended and highly gifted as he was, he had with difficulty surmounted the obstacles which impeded him in the road to fame. If he owed much to the bounty of nature and fortune, he had suffered still more from their spite. His features were frightfully harsh, his stature was diminutive, a huge and pointed hump rose on his back. His constitution was feeble and sickly. Cruel imputations had been thrown on his morals. He had been accused of trafficking with sorcerers and with vendors of poison, had languished long in a dungeon, and had at length regained his liberty without entirely regaining his honour. He had always been disliked both by Louvois and by Lewis. Yet the war against the European coalition had lasted but a very short time, when both the minister and the king felt that the general who was personally odious to them was necessary to the state. Conde and Turenne were no more, and Luxemburg was without dispute the first soldier that France still possessed. In vigilance, diligence and perseverance he was deficient. He seemed to reserve his great qualities for great emergencies. It was on a pitched field of battle that he was all himself. His glance was rapid and unerring. His judgment was clearest and surest when responsibility pressed heaviest on him and when difficulties gathered thickest around him. To his skill, energy, and presence of mind his country owed some glorious days. But, though eminently successful in battles, he was not eminently successful in campaigns. He gained immense renown at William's expense. And yet there was, as respected the objects of the war, little to choose between the two commanders. Luxemburg was repeatedly victorious, but he had not the art of improving a victory. William was repeatedly defeated, but of all generals he was the best qualified to repair a defeat. End of section 2. Recording by Jen Raimundo. Section 3 of Chapter 19 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 19, Section 3. In the month of July, William's headquarters were at Lambeque. About 6 miles off, at Steinkirk, Luxembourg had encamped with the main body of his army, and about 6 miles further off lay a considerable force commanded by the Marquess of Boufflers, one of the best officers in the service of Louis. The country between Lambeque and Steinkirk was intersected by innumerable hedges and ditches, and neither army could approach the other without passing through several long and narrow defiles. Luxembourg had therefore little reason to apprehend that he should be attacked in his entrenchments, and he felt assured that he should have ample notice before any attack was made, for he had succeeded in corrupting an adventurer named Millevoix, who was chief musician and private secretary of the Elector of Bavaria. This man regularly sent to the French headquarters authentic information touching the designs of the allies. The Marshal, confident in the strength of his position and in the accuracy of his intelligence, lived in his tent as he was accustomed to live in his hotel at Paris. He was at once a valetudinarian and a voluptuary, and in both characters he loved his ease. He scarcely ever mounted his horse. Light conversation and cards occupied most of his hours. His table was luxurious, and, when he had sate down to supper, it was a service of danger to disturb him. Some scoffers remarked that in his military dispositions he was not guided exclusively by military reasons, that he generally contrived to entrench himself in some place where the veal and the poultry were remarkably good, and that he was always solicitous to keep open such communications with the sea as might ensure him from September to April a regular supply of sandwich oysters. If there were any agreeable women in the neighbourhood of his camp, they were generally to be found at his banquets. It may easily be supposed that, under such a commander, the young princes and nobles of France vied with one another in splendour and gallantry. While he was amusing himself after his wonted fashion, the Confederate princes discovered that their counsels were betrayed. A peasant picked up a letter which had been dropped, and carried it to the Elector of Bavaria. It contained full proofs of the guilt of Millevoix. William conceived a hope that he might be able to take his enemies in the snare which they had laid for him. The perfidious secretary was summoned to the royal presence and taxed with his crime. A pen was put into his hand, a pistol was held to his breast, and he was commanded to write on pain of instant death. His letter, dictated by William, was conveyed to the French camp. It apprised Luxembourg that the allies meant to send out a strong foraging party on the next day. In order to protect this party from molestation, some battalions of infantry, accompanied by artillery, would march by night to occupy the defiles which lay between the armies. The Marshal read, believed, and went to rest, while William urged forward the preparations for a general assault on the French lines. The whole allied army was under arms while it was still dark. In the grey of the morning Luxembourg was awakened by scouts, who brought tidings that the enemy was advancing in great force. He at first treated the news very lightly. His correspondent, it seemed, had been, as usual, diligent and exact. The Prince of Orange had sent out a detachment to protect his foragers, and this detachment had been magnified by fear into a great host. But one alarming report followed another fast. All the passes, it was said, were choked with multitudes of foot, horses, and artillery, under the banners of England and of Spain, of the United Provinces and of the Empire, and every column was moving towards Steinkirk. At length the Marshal rose, got on horseback, and rode out to see what was doing. By this time the vanguard of the allies was close to his outposts. About half a mile in advance of his army was encamped a brigade named from the province of Bourbonnais. These troops had to bear the first brunt of the onset. Amazed and panic-stricken, they were swept away in a moment, and ran for their lives, leaving their tents and 7 pieces of cannon to the assailants. Thus far William's plans had been completely successful, but now fortune began to turn against him. He had been misinformed as to the nature of the ground which lay between the station of the brigade of Bourbonnais and the main encampment of the enemy. He had expected that he should be able to push forward without a moment's pause, that he should find the French army in a state of wild disorder, and that his victory would be easy and complete. But his progress was obstructed by several fences and ditches. There was a short delay, and a short delay sufficed to frustrate his design. Luxembourg was the very man for such a conjecture. He had committed great faults, he had kept careless guard, he had trusted implicitly to information which had proved false, he had neglected information which had proved true. One of his divisions was flying in confusion, the other divisions were unprepared for action. That crisis would have paralysed the faculties of an ordinary captain, it only braced and stimulated those of Luxembourg. His mind, nay, his sickly and distorted body, seemed to derive health and vigour from disaster and dismay. In a short time he had disposed everything. The French army was in battle order. Conspicuous in that great array were the household troops of Louis, the most renowned body of fighting men in Europe, and at their head appeared, glittering in lace and embroidery hastily thrown on and half fastened, a crowd of young princes and lords who had just been roused by the trumpet from their couches or their revels, and who had hastened to look death in the face with the gay and festive intrepidity characteristic of French gentlemen. Highest in rank among these high-born warriors was a lad of 16, Philip, Duke of Schart, son of the Duke of Orleans and nephew of the King of France. It was with difficulty and by importunate solicitation that the gallant boy had extorted Luxemburg's permission to be where the fire was hottest. Two other youths of royal blood, Louis, Duke of Bourbon, and Armand, Prince of Conti, showed a spirit worthy of their descent. With them was a descendant of one of the bastards of Henry IV, Louis, Duke of Vendôme, a man sunk in indolence and in the foulest vice, yet capable of exhibiting on a great occasion the qualities of a great soldier. Berwick, who was beginning to earn for himself an honourable name in arms, was there, and at his side rode Sarsfield, whose courage and ability earned on that day the esteem of the whole French army. Meanwhile Luxemburg had sent off a pressing message to summon Boufflers. But the message was needless. Boufflers had heard the firing, and, like a brave and intelligent captain, was already hastening towards the point from which the sound came. Though the assailants had lost all the advantage which belongs to a surprise, they came on manfully. In the front of the battle were the British commanded by Count Solmes. The division which was to lead the way was Mackay's. He was to have been supported, according to William's plan, by a strong body of foot and horse. Though most of Mackay's men had never been under fire, their behaviour gave promise of Blenheim and Ramillies. They first encountered the Swiss, who held a distinguished place in the French army. The fight was so close and desperate that the muzzles of the muskets crossed. The Swiss were driven back with fearful slaughter. More than 1,800 of them appear from the French returns to have been killed or wounded. Luxemburg afterwards said that he had never in his life seen so furious a struggle. He collected in haste the opinion of the generals who surrounded him. All thought that the emergency was one which could be met by no common means. The king's household must charge the English. The marshal gave the word, and the household, headed by the princes of the blood, came on, flinging their muskets back on their shoulders. "Sword in hand!" was the cry through all the ranks of that terrible brigade. "Sword in hand! No firing! Do it with cold steel!" After a long and desperate resistance, the English were borne down. They never ceased to repeat that, if Solmes had done his duty by them, they would have beaten even the household. But Solmes gave them no effective support. He pushed forward some cavalry which, from the nature of the ground, could do little or nothing. His infantry he would not suffer to stir. They could do no good, he said, and he would not send them to be slaughtered. Ormond was eager to hasten to the assistance of his countrymen, but was not permitted. Mackay sent a pressing message to represent that he and his men were left to certain destruction, but all was vain. "God's will be done," said the brave veteran. He died as he had lived, like a good Christian and a good soldier. With him fell Douglas and Lanier, two generals distinguished among the conquerors of Ireland. Mountjoy too was among the slain. After languishing 3 years in the Bastille, he had just been exchanged for Richard Hamilton, and having been converted to Whiggism by wrongs more powerful than all the arguments of Locke and Sidney, had instantly hastened to join William's camp as a volunteer. 5 fine regiments were entirely cut to pieces. No part of this devoted band would have escaped but for the courage and conduct of Auverquerque, who came to the rescue in the moment of extremity with 2 fresh battalions. The gallant manner in which he brought off the remains of Mackay's division was long remembered with grateful admiration by the British campfires. The ground where the conflict had raged was piled with corpses, and those who buried the slain remarked that almost all the wounds had been given in close fighting by the sword or the bayonet. It was said that William so far forgot his wonted stoicism as to utter a passionate exclamation at the way in which the English regiments had been sacrificed. Soon, however, he recovered his equanimity and determined to fall back. It was high time, for the French army was every moment becoming stronger, as the regiments commanded by Boufflers came up in rapid succession. The allied army returned to Lambeque unpursued and in unbroken order. The French owned that they had about 7,000 men killed and wounded. The loss of the allies had been little, if at all greater. The relative strength of the armies was what it had been on the preceding day, and they continued to occupy their old positions. But the moral effect of the battle was great. The splendour of William's fame grew pale. Even his admirers were forced to own that, in the field, he was not a match for Luxemburg. In France the news was received with transports of joy and pride. The court, the capital, even the peasantry of the remotest provinces, gloried in the impetuous valour which had been displayed by so many youths, the heirs of illustrious names. It was exultingly and fondly repeated all over the kingdom that the young Duke of Schart could not by any remonstrances be kept out of danger, that a ball had passed through his coat, that he had been wounded in the shoulder. The people lined the roads to see the princes and nobles who returned from Steinkirk. The jewellers devised Steinkirk buckles, the perfumers sold Steinkirk powder. But the name of the field of battle was peculiarly given to a new species of collar. Lace neckcloths were then worn by men of fashion, and it had been usual to arrange them with great care. But at the terrible moment when the brigade of Bourbonnais was flying before the onset of the allies, there was no time for foppery, and the finest gentlemen of the court came spurring to the front of the line of battle with their rich cravats in disorder. It therefore became a fashion among the beauties of Paris to wear round their necks kerchiefs of the finest lace studiously disarranged, and these kerchiefs were called Steinkirks. In the camp of the allies all was disunion and discontent. National jealousies and animosities raged without restraint or disguise. The resentment of the English was loudly expressed. Solmes, though he was said by those who knew him well to have some valuable qualities, was not a man likely to conciliate soldiers who were prejudiced against him as a foreigner. His demeanour was arrogant, his temper ungovernable. Even before the unfortunate day of Steinkirk, the English officers did not willingly communicate with him, and the private men murmured at his harshness. But after the battle the outcry against him became furious. He was accused, perhaps unjustly, of having said with unfeeling levity, while the English regiments were contending desperately against great odds, that he was curious to see how the bulldogs would come off. Would anybody, it was asked, now pretend that it was on account of his superior skill and experience that he had been put over the heads of so many English officers? It was the fashion to say that those officers had never seen war on a large scale. But surely the merest novice was competent to do all that Solmes had done, to misunderstand orders, to send cavalry on duty which none but infantry could perform, and to look on at safe distance while brave men were cut to pieces. It was too much to be at once insulted and sacrificed, excluded from the honours of war, yet pushed on all its extreme dangers, sneered at as raw recruits, and then left to cope unsupported with the finest body of veterans in the world. Such were the complaints of the English army, and they were echoed by the English nation. Fortunately, about this time a discovery was made which furnished both the camp at Lambeque and the coffeehouses of London with a subject of conversation much less agreeable to the Jacobites than the disaster of Steinkirk. A plot against the life of William had been, during some months, maturing in the French War Office. It should seem that Louvois had originally sketched the design, and had bequeathed it, still rude, to his son and successor Barbesieux. By Barbesieux the plan was perfected. The execution was entrusted to an officer named Granval. Granval was undoubtedly brave, and full of zeal for his country and his religion. He was indeed flighty and half-witted, but not on that account the less dangerous. Indeed, a flighty and half-witted man is the very instrument generally preferred by cunning politicians when very hazardous work is to be done. No shrewd calculator would, for any bribe, however enormous, have exposed himself to the fate of Châtel, of Ravillac, or of Gerard. Granval secured, as he conceived, the assistance of two adventurers, Dumont, a Walloon, and Leefdale, a Dutchman. In April, soon after William had arrived in the Low Countries, the murderers were directed to repair to their post. Dumont was then in Westphalia. Granval and Leefdale were at Paris. Uden in North Brabant was fixed at the place where the three were to meet and whence they were to proceed together to the headquarters of the allies. Before Granval left Paris, he paid a visit to Saint-Germain, and was presented to James and to Mary of Modena. "I have been informed," said James, "of the business. If you and your companions do me this service, you shall never want." After this audience Granval set out on his journey. He had not the faintest suspicion that he had been betrayed both by the accomplice who accompanied him and by the accomplice whom he was going to meet. Dumont and Leefdale were not enthusiasts. They cared nothing for the restoration of James, the grandeur of Louis, or the ascendancy of the Church of Rome. It was plain to every man of common sense that, whether the design succeeded or failed, the reward of the assassins would probably be to be disowned, with affected abhorrence, by the courts of Versailles and Saint-Germain, and to be torn with red-hot pincers, smeared with melted lead, and dismembered by 4 horses. To vulgar natures the prospect of such a martyrdom was not alluring. Both these men, therefore, had almost at the same time, though, as far as appears, without any concert, conveyed to William, through different channels, warnings that his life was in danger. Dumont had acknowledged everything to the Duke of Zell, one of the Confederate princes. Leefdale had transmitted full intelligence through his relations who resided in Holland. Meanwhile Morel, a Swiss Protestant of great learning who was then in France, wrote to inform Burnet that the weak and hot-headed Grandval had been heard to talk boastfully of the event which would soon astonish the world, and had confidently predicted that the Prince of Orange would not live to the end of next month. These cautions were not neglected. From the moment at which Grandval entered the Netherlands, his steps were among snares. His movements were watched, his words were noted. He was arrested, examined, confronted with his accomplices, and sent to the camp of the Allies. About a week after the battle of Steinkirk he was brought before a court-martial. Ginkell, who had been rewarded for his great services in Ireland with the title of Earl of Athlone, presided, and Talmash was among the judges. Mackay and Lanier had been named members of the board, but they were no more, and their places were filled by younger officers. The duty of the court-martial was very simple, for the prisoner attempted no defence. His conscience had, it should seem, been suddenly awakened. He admitted, with expressions of remorse, the truth of all the charges, made a minute and apparently an ingenious confession, and owned that he had deserved death. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, and underwent his punishment with great fortitude and with a show of piety. He left behind him a few lines, in which he declared that he was about to lose his life for having too faithfully obeyed the injunctions of Barbesieux. End of section 3. Recording by Jen Raimundo. Section 4 of Chapter 19 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 19, Section 4. His confession was immediately published in several languages, and was read with very various and very strong emotions. That it was genuine could not be doubted, for it was warranted by the signatures of some of the most distinguished military men living. That it was prompted by the hope of pardon could hardly be supposed, for William had taken pains to discourage that hope. Still less could it be supposed that the prisoner had uttered untruths in order to avoid the torture, for, though it was the universal practice in the Netherlands to put convicted assassins to the rack in order to wring out from them the names of their employers and associates, William had given orders that, on this occasion, the rack should not be used or even named. It should be added that the court did not interrogate the prisoner closely, but suffered him to tell his story in his own way. It is therefore reasonable to believe that his narrative is substantially true, and no part of it has a stronger air of truth than his account of the audience with which James had honoured him at Saint-Germain. In our island the sensation produced by the news was great. The Whigs loudly called both James and Lewis assassins. How, it was asked, was it possible, without outraging common sense, to put an innocent meaning on the words which Grandval declared that he had heard from the lips of the banished King of England? And who that knew the court of Versailles would believe that Barbesieux, a youth, a mere novice in politics, and rather a clerk than a minister, would have dared to do what he had done without taking his master's pleasure? Very charitable and very ignorant persons might perhaps indulge a hope that Lewis had not been an accessory before the fact, but that he was an accessory after the fact no human being could doubt. He must have seen the proceedings of the court-martial, the evidence, the confession. If he really abhorred assassination as honest men abhor it, would not Barbesieux have been driven with ignominy from the royal presence and flung into the Bastille? Yet Barbesieux was still at the War Office, and it was not pretended that he had been punished even by a word or a frown. It was plain, then, that both kings were partakers in the guilt of Grandval. And if it were asked how two princes who made a high profession of religion could have fallen into such wickedness, the answer was that they had learned their religion from the Jesuits. In reply to these reproaches, the English Jacobites said very little, and the French government said nothing at all. The campaign in the Netherlands ended without any other event deserving to be recorded. On the 18th of October William arrived in England. Late in the evening of the 20th he reached Kensington, having traversed the whole length of the capital. His reception was cordial. The crowd was great, the acclamations were loud, and all the windows along his route, from Aldgate to Piccadilly, were lighted up. But, notwithstanding these favourable symptoms, the nation was disappointed and discontented. The war had been unsuccessful by land. By sea a great advantage had been gained, but had not been improved. The general expectation had been that the victory of May would be followed by a descent on the coast of France, that St. Malo would be bombarded, that the last remains of Tourville's squadron would be destroyed, and that the arsenals of Brest and Rochefort would be laid in ruins. This expectation was, no doubt, unreasonable. It did not follow, because Rooke and his seamen had silenced the batteries hastily thrown up by Bellefonds, that it would be safe to expose ships to the fire of regular fortresses. The government, however, was not less sanguine than the nation. Great preparations were made. The allied fleet, having been speedily refitted at Portsmouth, stood out again to sea. Rooke was sent to examine the soundings and the currents along the shore of Brittany. Transports were collected at St. Helens. 14,000 troops were assembled on Portsdown under the command of Meinhart Schomberg, who had been rewarded for his father's services and his own with the highest rank in the Irish peerage, and was now Duke of Leinster. Under him were Ruvigny, who, for his good service at Aghrim, had been created Earl of Galway, La Millionaire and Cambon with their gallant bands of refugees, and Argyle with the regiment which bore his name, and which, as it began to be rumoured, had last winter done something strange and horrible in a wild country of rocks and snow, never yet explored by any Englishman. On the 26th of July the troops were all on board. The transport sailed, and in a few hours joined the naval armament in the neighbourhood of Portland. On the 28th the General Council of War was held. All the naval commanders, with Russell at their head, declared that it would be madness to carry their ships within the range of the guns of St. Malo, and that the town must be reduced to straits by land before the men of war in the harbour could, with any chance of success, be attacked from the sea. The military men declared with equal unanimity that the land forces could effect nothing against the town without the cooperation of the fleet. It was then considered whether it would be advisable to make an attempt on Brest or Rochefort. Russell and the other flag officers, among whom were Rooke, Shovel, Almond and Everston, pronounced that the summer was too far spent for either enterprise. We must suppose that an opinion in which so many distinguished admirals, both English and Dutch, concurred, however strange it may seem to us, was in conformity with what were then the established principles of the art of maritime war. But while these questions could not have been fully discussed a week earlier, why 14,000 troops should have been shipped and sent to sea before it had been considered what they were to do, or whether it would be possible for them to do anything, we may reasonably wonder. The armament returned to St. Helens, to the astonishment and disgust of the whole nation. The ministers blamed the commanders blamed the ministers. The recriminations exchanged between Nottingham and Russell were loud and angry. Nottingham, honest, industrious, versed in civil business, and eloquent in parliamentary debate, was deficient in the qualities of a war minister, and was not at all aware of his deficiencies. Between him and the whole body of professional sailors there was a feud of long standing. He had, some time before the Revolution, been a Lord of the Admiralty, and his own opinion was that he had then acquired a profound knowledge of maritime affairs. This opinion, however, he had very much to himself. Men who had passed half their lives on the waves, and who had been in battles, storms and shipwrecks, were impatient of his somewhat pompous lectures and reprimands, and pronounced him a mere pedant, who, with all his book learning, was ignorant of what every cabin boy knew. Russell had always been forward, arrogant and mutinous, and now prosperity and glory brought out his vices in full strength. With the government which he had saved, he took all the liberties of an insolent servant who believes himself to be necessary, treated the orders of his superiors with contemptuous levity, resented reproof, however gentle, as an outrage, furnished no plan of his own, and showed a sullen determination to execute no plan furnished by anybody else. To Nottingham he had a strong and very natural antipathy. They were indeed an ill-matched pair. Nottingham was a Tory. Russell was a Whig. Nottingham was a speculative seaman, confident in his theories. Russell was a practical seaman, proud of his achievements. The strength of Nottingham lay in speech, the strength of Russell lay in action. Nottingham's demeanour was decorous even to formality. Russell was passionate and rude. Lastly, Nottingham was an honest man, and Russell was a villain. They now became mortal enemies. The Admiral sneered at the Secretary's ignorance of naval affairs. The Secretary accused the Admiral of sacrificing the public interests to mere wayward humour, and both were in the right. While they were wrangling, the merchants of all the ports in the kingdom raised a cry against the Naval Administration. The victory of which the nation was so proud was, in the city, pronounced to have been a positive disaster. During some months before the battle all the maritime strength of the enemy had been collected in two great masses, one in the Mediterranean and one in the Atlantic. There had consequently been little privateering, and the voyage to New England or Jamaica had been almost as safe as in time of peace. Since the battle, the remains of the force which had lately been collected under Tourville were dispersed over the ocean. Even the passage from England to Ireland was insecure. Every week it announced that 20, 30, 50 vessels belonging to London or Bristol had been taken by the French. More than 100 prizes were carried during that autumn into St. Malo alone. It would have been far better, in the opinion of the shipowners and of the underwriters, that the Royal Sun had still been afloat with 1,000 fighting men on board than that she should be lying a heap of ashes on the beach at Cherbourg, while her crew, distributed among 20 brigantines, prowled for booty over the sea between Cape Finisterre and Cape Clear. The privateers of Dunkirk had long been celebrated, and among them John Bart, humbly born and scarcely able to sign his name, but eminently brave and active, had attained an undisputed preeminence. In the country of Anson and Hawke, of Howe and Rodney, of Duncan, St. Vincent and Nelson, the name of the most daring and skilful corsair would have little chance of being remembered. But France, among whose many unquestioned titles to glory very few are derived from naval war, still ranks Bart among her great men. In the autumn of 1692 this enterprising freebooter was the terror of all the English and Dutch merchants who traded with the Baltic. He took and destroyed vessels close to the eastern coast of our island. He even ventured to land in Northumberland, and burned many houses before the trainbands could be collected to oppose him. The prizes which he carried back into his native port were estimated at about £100,000 sterling. About the same time a younger adventurer, destined to equal or surpass Bart, Du Guay-Trouin, was entrusted with the command of a small armed vessel. The intrepid boy, for he was not yet 20 years old, entered the estuary of the Shannon, sacked a mansion in the county of Clare, and did not re-embark till a detachment from the garrison of Limerick marched against him. While our trade was interrupted and our shores menaced by these rovers, some calamities which no human prudence could have averted increased the public ill humour. An earthquake of terrible violence laid waste in less than 3 minutes the flourishing colony of Jamaica. Whole plantations changed their place. Whole villages were swallowed up. Port Royal, the fairest and wealthiest city which the English had yet built in the New World, renowned for its quays, for its warehouses, and for its stately streets, which were said to rival Cheapside, was turned into a mass of ruins. 1,500 of the inhabitants were buried under their own dwellings. The effect of this disaster was severely felt by many of the great mercantile houses of London and Bristol. A still heavier calamity was the failure of the harvest. The summer had been wet all over Western Europe. Those heavy rains which had impeded the exertions of the French pioneers in the trenches of Namur had been fatal to the crops. Old men remembered no such year since 1648. No fruit ripened. The price of the quarter of wheat was doubled. The evil was aggravated by the state of the silver coin, which had been clipped to such an extent that the words pound and shilling had ceased to have a fixed meaning. Compared with France, indeed, England might well be esteemed prosperous. Here the public burdens were heavy. There they were crushing. Here the labouring man was forced to husband his coarse barley loaf, but there it not seldom happened that the wretched peasant was found dead on the earth with half-chewed grass in his mouth. Our ancestors found some consolation in thinking that they were gradually wearing out the strength of their formidable enemy, and that his resources were likely to be drained sooner than theirs. Still there was much suffering and much repining. In some counties mobs attacked the granaries. The necessity of retrenchment was felt by families of every rank. An idle man of wit and pleasure, who little thought that his buffoonery would ever be cited to illustrate the history of his times, complained that, in this year, wine ceased to be put on many hospitable tables where he had been accustomed to see it, and that its place was supplied by punch. A symptom of public distress much more alarming than the substitution of brandy and lemons for claret was the increase of crime. During the autumn of 1692 and the following winter, the capital was kept in constant terror by housebreakers. One gang, 13 strong, entered the mansion of the Duke of Ormond in St. James Square, and all but succeeded in carrying off his magnificent plate and jewels. Another gang made an attempt on Lambeth Palace. When stately abodes, guarded by numerous servants, were in such danger, it may easily be believed that no shopkeepers' till or stock could be safe. From Bow to Hyde Park, from Thames Street to Bloomsbury, there was no parish in which some quiet dwelling had not been sacked by burglars. Meanwhile the great roads were made almost impassable by freebooters who formed themselves into troops larger than had before been known. there was a sworn fraternity of 20 footpads which met at an alehouse in Southwark. But the most formidable band of plunderers consisted of 22 horsemen. It should seem that, at this time, a journey of 50 miles through the wealthiest and most populous shires of England was as dangerous as a pilgrimage across the deserts of Arabia. The Oxford stagecoach was pillaged in broad day after a bloody fight. A waggon laden with £15,000 of public money was stopped and ransacked. As this operation took some time, all the travellers who came to the spot while the thieves were busy were seized and guarded. When the booty had been secured, the prisoners were suffered to depart on foot, but their horses, 16 or 18 in number, were shot or hamstringed to prevent pursuit. The Portsmouth mail was robbed twice in 1 week by men well armed and mounted. Some jovial Essex squires, while riding after a hare, were themselves chased and run down by 9 hunters of a different sort, and were heartily glad to find themselves at home again, though with empty pockets. The friends of the government asserted that the marauders were all Jacobites, and indeed there were some appearances which gave colour to the assertion. For example, 15 butchers, going on a market day to buy beasts at Tame, were stopped by a large gang and compelled first to deliver their money bags and then to drink King James's health in brandy. The thieves, however, to do them justice, showed, in exercise of their calling, no decided preference for any political party. Some of them fell in with Marlborough near St. Albans, and notwithstanding his known hostility to the court and his recent imprisonment, compelled him to deliver up 500 guineas, which he doubtless never ceased to regret to the last moment of his long career of prosperity and glory. When William, on his return from the Continent, learned to what an extent these outrages were carried, he expressed great indignation and announced his resolution to put down the malefactors with a strong hand. A veteran robber was induced to turn informer, and to lay before the King a list of the chief highwaymen, and a full account of their habits and of their favourite haunts. It was said that this list contained not less than 80 names. Strong parties of cavalry were sent out to protect the roads, and this precaution, which would, in ordinary circumstances, have excited much murmuring, seems to have been generally approved. A fine regiment, now called the 2nd Dragoon Guards, which had distinguished itself in Ireland by activity and success in the irregular war against the Rapparees, was selected to guard several of the great avenues of the capital. Blackheath, Barnet, Hounslow became places of arms. In a few weeks the roads were as safe as usual. The executions were numerous, for, till the evil had been suppressed, the King resolutely refused to listen to any solicitations for mercy. Among those who suffered was James Whitney, the most celebrated captain of banditti in the kingdom. He had been, during some months, the terror of all who travelled from London either northward or westward, and was at length with difficulty secured after a desperate conflict in which 1 soldier was killed and several wounded. The London Gazette announced that the famous highwayman had been taken, and invited all persons who had been robbed by him to repair to Newgate and to see whether they could identify him. To identify him should have been easy, for he had a wound in the face and had lost a thumb. He, however, in the hope of perplexing the witnesses for the Crown, expended £100 in procuring a sumptuous embroidered suit against the day of trial. This ingenious device was frustrated by his hard-hearted keepers. He was put to the bar in his ordinary clothes, convicted and sentenced to death. He had previously tried to ransom himself by offering to raise a fine troop of cavalry, all highwaymen, for service in Flanders, but his offer had been rejected. He had one resource still left. He declared that he was privy to a treasonable plot. Some Jacobite lords had promised him immense rewards if he would, at the head of his gang, fall upon the King at a stag hunt in Windsor Forest. There was nothing intrinsically improbable in Whitney's story. Indeed, a design very similar to that which he imputed to the malcontents was, only 3 years later, actually formed by some of them, and was all but carried into execution. But it was far better that a few bad men should go unpunished than that all honest men should live in fear of being falsely accused by felons sentenced to the gallows. Chief Justice Holt advised the King to let the law take its course. William, never much inclined to give credit to stories about conspiracies, assented. The captain, as he was called, was hanged in Smithfield, and made a most penitent end. End of section 4. Recording by Jen Raimundo.
Section 5 of Chapter 19 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 19, Section 5. Meanwhile, in the midst of discontent, distress and disorder, had begun a session of Parliament singularly eventful, a session from which dates a new era in the history of English finance, a session in which some grave constitutional questions, not entirely set at rest, were for the first time debated. It is to be much lamented that any account of this session, which can be framed out of the scanty and dispersed materials now accessible, must leave many things obscure. The relations of the parliamentary factions were, during this year, in a singularly complicated state. Each of the two houses was divided and subdivided by several lines. To omit minor distinctions, there was the great line which separated the Whig party from the Tory party, and there was the great line which separated the official men and their friends and dependents, who were sometimes called the Court party, from those who were sometimes nicknamed the Grumbletonians and sometimes honoured with the appellation of the Country party. And these two lines were intersecting lines, for the servants of the Crown and of their adherents about one half were Whigs and one half Tories. It is also to be remembered that there were, quite distinct from the feud between the Whigs and the Tories, quite distinct also from the feud between those who were in and those who were out, a feud between the Lords as Lords and the Commons as Commons, the spirit quite of the hereditary and of the elective chamber had been thoroughly roused in the preceding session by the dispute about the court of the Lord High Steward, and they met in a pugnacious mood. The speech which the King made at the opening of the session was skilfully framed for the purpose of conciliating the Houses. He came, he told them, to ask for their advice and assistance. He congratulated them on the victory of La Hogue. He acknowledged with much concern that the operations of the allies had been less successful by land than by sea, but he warmly declared that both by land and by sea the valour of his English subjects had been preeminently conspicuous. The distress of his people, he said, was his own. His interest was inseparable from theirs. It was painful to him to call on them to make sacrifices, but from sacrifices which were necessary to the safety of the English nation and of the Protestant religion, no good Englishman and no good Protestant would shrink. The Commons thanked the King in cordial terms for his gracious speech, but the Lords were in a bad humour. Two of their body, Marlborough and Huntingdon, had, during the recess, when an invasion and an insurrection were hourly expected, been sent to the Tower, and were still under reconnaissances. Had a country gentleman or a merchant been taken up and held to bail on even slighter grounds at so alarming a crisis, the Lords would assuredly not have interfered. But they were easily moved to anger by any thing that looked like an indignity offered to their own order. They not only cross-examined with great severity Aaron Smith, the Solicitor of the Treasury, whose character, to say the truth, entitled him to little indulgence, but passed by 35 votes to 28 a resolution implying a censure on the judges of the King's Bench, men certainly not inferior in probity and very far superior in legal learning to any peer of the realm. The King thought it prudent to soothe the wounded pride of the nobility by ordering the reconnaissances to be cancelled, and with this concession the House was satisfied, to the great vexation of the Jacobites, who had hoped that the quarrel would be prosecuted to some fatal issue, and who, finding themselves disappointed, vented their spleen by railing at the tameness of the degenerate barons of England. Both Houses held long and earnest deliberations on the state of the nation. The King, when he requested their advice, had perhaps not foreseen that his words would be construed into an invitation to scrutinise every part of the administration, and to offer suggestions touching matters which Parliaments have generally thought it expedient to leave entirely to the Crown. Some of the discontented peers proposed that a committee, chosen partly by the Lords and partly by the Commons, should be authorised to inquire into the whole management of public affairs. But it was generally apprehended that such a committee would become a second and more powerful Privy Council, independent of the Crown and unknown to the Constitution. The motion was therefore rejected by 48 votes to 36. On this occasion the ministers, with scarcely an exception, voted in the majority. A protest was signed by 18 of the minority, among whom were the bitterest Whigs and the bitterest Tories in the whole peerage. The Houses inquired, each for itself, into the causes of the public calamities. The Commons resolved themselves into a grand committee to consider of the advice to be given to the King. From the concise abstracts and fragments which have come down to us, it seems that, in this committee, which continued to sit many days, the debates wandered over a vast space. One member spoke of the prevalence of highway robbery. Another deplored the quarrel between the Queen and the Princess, and proposed that 2 or 3 gentlemen should be deputed to wait on Her Majesty and try to make matters up. A third described the machinations of the Jacobites in the preceding spring. It was notorious, he said, that preparations had been made for a rising, and that arms and horses had been collected, yet not a single traitor had been brought to justice. The events of the war by land and sea furnished matter for several earnest debates. Many members complained of the preference given to aliens over Englishmen. The whole battle of Steinkirk was fought over again, and severe reflections were thrown on Solmes. Let English soldiers be commanded by none but English generals, was the almost universal cry. Seymour, who had once been distinguished by his hatred of the foreigners, but who, since he had been at the Board of Treasury, had reconsidered his opinions, asked where English generals were to be found. "I have no love for foreigners as foreigners, but we have no choice. Men are not born generals. Nay, a man may be a very valuable captain or major, and not be equal to the conduct of an army. Nothing but experience will form great commanders. Very few of our countrymen have that experience, and therefore we must, for the present, employ strangers." Lowther followed on the same side. "We have had a long peace, and the consequence is that we have not a sufficient supply of officers fit for high commands. The parks and the camp at Hounslow were very poor military schools when compared with the fields of battle and the lines of contravallation in which the great commanders of the continental nation have learned their art." In reply to these arguments, an orator on the other side was so absurd as to declare that he could point out 10 Englishmen who, if they were in the French service, would be made marshals. 4 or 5 colonels who had been at Steinkirk took part in the debate. It was said of them that they showed as much modesty in speech as they had shown courage in action, and from the very imperfect report which has come down to us, the compliment seems to have been not undeserved. They did not join in the vulgar cry against the Dutch. They spoke well of the foreign officers generally, and did full justice to the valour and conduct with which Auverquerque had rescued the shattered remains of Mackay's division from what seemed certain destruction. But in defence of Solmes not a word was said. His severity, his haughty manners, and above all the indifference with which he had looked on while the English, borne down by overwhelming numbers, were fighting hand to hand with the French household troops, had made him so odious that many members were prepared to vote for an address requesting that he might be removed, and that his place might be filled by Talmash, who, since the disgrace of Marlborough, was universally allowed to be the best officer in the army. But Talmash's friends judiciously interfered. "I have," said one of them, "a true regard for that gentleman, and I implore you not to do him an injury under the notion of doing him a kindness. Consider that you are usurping what is peculiarly the King's prerogative. You are turning officers out and putting officers in." The debate ended without any vote of censure on Solmes, but a hope was expressed, in language not very parliamentary, that what had been said in the committee would be reported to the King, and that His Majesty would not disregard the general wish of the representatives of his people. The Commons next proceeded to inquire into the Naval Administration, and very soon came to a quarrel with the Lords on that subject. That there had been mismanagement somewhere was but too evident. It was hardly possible to acquit both Russell and Nottingham, and each House stood by its own member. The Commons had, at the opening of the session, unanimously passed a vote of thanks to Russell for his conduct at La Hogue. They now, in the Grand Committee of Advice, took into consideration the miscarriages which had followed the battle. A motion was made, so vaguely worded that it could hardly be said to mean anything. It was understood, however, to imply a censure on Nottingham, and was therefore strongly opposed by his friends. On the division the ayes were 165, the noes 164. On the very next day Nottingham appealed to the Lords. He told his story with the skill of a practised orator, and with all the authority which belongs to unblemished integrity. He then laid on the table a great mass of papers, which he requested the House to read and consider. The Peers seem to have examined the papers seriously and diligently. The result of the examination was by no means favourable to Russell, yet it was thought unjust to condemn him unheard, and it was difficult to devise any way in which their lordships could hear him. At last it was resolved to send the papers down to the Commons with a message which imported that, in the opinion of the Upper House, there was a case against the Admiral which he ought to be called upon to answer. With the papers was sent an abstract of the contents. The message was not very respectfully received. Russell had, at that moment, a popularity which he little deserved, but which will not surprise us when we remember that the public knew nothing of his treasons, and knew that he was the only living Englishman who had won a great battle. The abstract of the papers was read by the clerk. Russell then spoke with great applause, and his friends pressed for an immediate decision. Sir Christopher Musgrave very justly observed that it was impossible to pronounce judgment on such a pile of dispatches without perusing them. But this objection was overruled. The Whigs regarded the accused member as one of themselves. Many of the Tories were dazzled by the splendour of his recent victory, and neither Whigs nor Tories were disposed to show any deference for the authority of the Peers. The House, without reading the papers, passed a unanimous resolution expressing warm approbation of Russell's whole conduct. The temper of the assembly was such that some ardent Whigs thought that they might now venture to propose a vote of censure on Nottingham by name, but the attempt failed. "I am ready," said Lowther, and he doubtless expressed what many felt, "I am ready to support any motion that may do honour to the Admiral, but I cannot join in an attack on the Secretary of State. For, to my knowledge, their Majesties have no more zealous, laborious, or faithful servant than my Lord Nottingham." Finch exerted all his mellifluous eloquence in defence of his brother, and contrived, without directly opposing himself to the prevailing sentiment, to insinuate that Russell's conduct had not been faultless. The vote of censure on Nottingham was not pressed. The vote which pronounced Russell's conduct to have been deserving of all praise was communicated to the Lords, and the papers which they had sent down were very unceremoniously returned. The Lords, much offended, demanded a free conference. It was granted, and the managers of the two Houses met in the Painted Chamber. Rochester, in the name of his brethren, expressed a wish to be informed of the grounds on which the Admiral had been declared faultless. To this appeal the gentlemen who stood on the other side of the table answered only that they had not been authorised to give any explanation, but that they would report to those who had sent them what had been said. By this time the Commons were thoroughly tired of the inquiry into the conduct of the war. The members had got rid of much of the ill humour which they had brought up with them from their country seats by the simple process of talking it away. Burnet hints that those arts of which Carmarthen and Trevor were the great masters were employed for the purpose of averting votes which would have seriously embarrassed the government. But though it is not improbable that a few noisy pretenders to patriotism may have been quieted with bags of guineas, it would be absurd to suppose that the House generally was influenced in this manner. Whoever has seen anything of such assemblies knows that the spirit with which they enter on long inquiries very soon flags, and that their resentment, if not kept alive by injudicious opposition, cools fast. In a short time everybody was sick of the Grand Committee of Advice. The debates had been tedious and desultory. The resolutions which had been carried were for the most part merely childish. The King was to be humbly advised to employ men of ability and integrity. He was to be humbly advised to employ men who would stand by him against James. The patience of the House was wearied by long discussions ending in the pompous promulgations of truisms like these. At last the explosion came. One of the grumblers called the attention of the Grand Committee to the alarming fact that 2 Dutchmen were employed in the Ordnance Department, and moved that the King should be humbly advised to dismiss them. The motion was received with disdainful mockery. It was remarked that the military men especially were loud in the expression of contempt. Do we seriously think of going to the King and telling him that, as he has condescended to ask our advice at this momentous crisis, we humbly advise him to turn a Dutch storekeeper out of the Tower? Really, if we have no more important suggestion to carry up to the throne, we may as well go to our dinners." The members generally were of the same mind. The chairman was voted out of the chair, and was not directed to ask leave to sit again. The Grand Committee ceased to exist. The resolutions which it had passed were formally reported to the House. One of them was rejected. The others were suffered to drop, and the Commons, after considering during several weeks what advice they should give to the King, ended by giving him no advice at all. The temper of the Lords was different. From many circumstances it appears that there was no place where the Dutch were, at this time, so much hated as in the Upper House. The dislike with which an Englishman of the middle class regarded the King's foreign friends was merely national, but the dislike with which an English nobleman regarded them was personal. They stood between him and majesty. They intercepted from him the rays of royal favour. The preference given to them wounded him both in his interests and in his pride. His chance of the Garter was much smaller since they had become his competitors. He might have been Master of the Horse but for Overquerque, Master of the Robes but for Zulestein, Groom of the Stole but for Bentinck. The ill humour of the aristocracy was inflamed by Marlborough, who at this time affected the character of a patriot persecuted for standing up against the Dutch in defence of the interests of his native land, and who did not foresee that a day would come when he would be accused of sacrificing the interests of his native land to gratify the Dutch. The Peers determined to present an address, requesting William not to place his English troops under the command of a foreign general. They took up very seriously that question which had moved the House of Commons to laughter, and solemnly counselled their Sovereign not to employ foreigners in his magazines. At Marlborough's suggestion they urged the King to insist that the youngest English general should take precedence of the oldest general in the service of the States General. It was, they said, derogatory to the dignity of the Crown that an officer who held a commission from His Majesty should ever be commanded by an officer who held a similar commission from a republic. To this advice, evidently dictated by an ignoble malevolence to Holland, William, who troubled himself little about votes of the Upper House which were not backed by the Lower, returned, as might have been expected, a very short and dry answer. End of section 5.